Imagine that someone breaks into your house this afternoon and burns everything you've ever written. Your letters, your journals, your notes, your memories, everything. Now imagine that happening to an entire people. That's not a metaphor. It is what happened, time and again, for thousands of years before 1800. And what was lost was not simply words on paper. It was astronomy that we did not rediscover until centuries later. It was medicine that would have saved lives. It was history that we can no longer recover. It was proof that entire civilizations thought, dreamed, and understood the world in ways we can barely imagine today. Someone made the decision that this knowledge should not exist. They did it in China, in Egypt, in Yucatan, in Florence, in Rome, in Baghdad. Emperors, bishops, caliphs, and preachers did it. And they did it in every case for exactly the same reason, because books are more dangerous than armies, because an army conquers territories, but a book conquers minds. And the mind that reads, the mind that compares, the mind that remembers what was, is the hardest mind to govern. This is the story that nobody taught you in full at school, not because it's secret, but because it's too uncomfortable. Let's start at the beginning. The year is 213 BC. The place is China. And the man who is about to commit the first great crime against human knowledge is also, paradoxically, one of the most ambitious builders history has ever known. His name is Qin Shi Huang, and he had just unified China for the first time. Think about it for a moment. This man built the Great Wall. He built one of the most advanced road systems of the ancient world. He standardized writing, currency, weights, and measures across a vast territory. He was, in many ways, a genius of political organization, and he was also a man who didn't sleep well at night, because books kept him awake. Not in the way books keep us awake. It wasn't the thrill of a good read, it was fear. It was the certainty that in those libraries scattered throughout the empire lay the stories of the kings who came before him, the reflections of the philosophers of the 100 schools of thought, the poems describing a world that had existed before. He decided that history would begin with him. His chancellor was named Li Si, and it was Li Si who told him what the emperor already suspected, that a scholar who knows the past can compare that past to the present, and a man who compares has questions, and a man who has questions is a man who can question, and a man who can question is the end of any tyranny. The solution was simple in its brutality. In the year 213 BC, Qin Shi Huang ordered that all books in the empire be handed over to local authorities to be burned, all works of the classic of poetry, all historical records of the kingdoms that preceded his own, all philosophical texts from every school except one, legalism, the regime's official philosophy. The deadline was 30 days. Anyone who failed to hand over their books within that time would be sent north to build the Great Wall. Anyone who quoted from memory the banned books would be publicly executed. Anyone who used history to criticize the present would ensure that not only they, but their entire family would be sentenced to death. The only books that were spared were those on medicine, agriculture, arboriculture, and divination. Knowledge useful to the state, knowledge that does not raise questions. And the following year, according to Sima Qian's historical records, 460 scholars were buried alive on the outskirts of the capital. 460 people. Buried alive for reading. There is something even more disturbing when you stop to think about it slowly. Qin Shi Huang himself kept copies of all the banned books in his imperial library. He burned them for the people. He kept them for himself. Because knowledge was not dangerous in and of itself. It was dangerous in the hands of anyone who could use it to question him. When the emperor died in 210 BOCO, those copies remained in his palace. But 6 years after his death, in the chaos that followed the collapse of his dynasty, the rebel Xiang Yu set fire to the palace at Xianyang, and the last copies of everything Qin had destroyed burned with it. History had taken its revenge. The writer Jorge Luis Borges captured it with devastating precision in a 1950 essay. The same mind that built the greatest wall in history, built to protect something, was the same one that destroyed the books containing the memory of everything that needed protecting. Borges could not decide which of the two feats was greater. And perhaps that is exactly the point. The power that builds and the power that destroys are all too often one and the same. But the history of the destruction of knowledge does not begin in China, and it does not end there. There is a name everyone knows, a building that has become the most powerful symbol of what humanity stands to lose. A place historians have mourned for centuries, and whose destruction has been recounted in so many different ways that reality has almost been lost beneath the versions, the Library of Alexandria. And this is where the story gets more complicated and richer and more honest, because the version you were probably told about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria is false, or at least it is so incomplete that it amounts to a falsehood. And understanding why it is false tells you something much deeper about how knowledge dies than any simplified version could ever tell you. The Library of Alexandria was founded in the 3rd century BC by the successors of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. It was part of a larger complex called the Mouseion, a sort of ancient university, a place where the finest minds of Greece, Egypt, Babylon, and Persia converged to study, to translate, to debate. The stated goal was to gather all the knowledge of the known world in one place, and they pursued it with a seriousness that is astonishing. Ships docking at the port of Alexandria were searched and inspected. If they carried books on board, they were confiscated, urgently copied, and the copy returned to the owner. The original remained in the library. Ptolemy III borrowed the original texts of the great works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from the city of Athens, posting a huge bond as collateral. He kept the originals and returned copies. He preferred to forfeit the bond. Estimates of its size range from 200,000 to 700,000 scrolls. No one knows the exact number because no complete catalog has survived, and that detail alone tells us something about the scale of what was lost. Who destroyed it? Brace yourself, because the correct answer is several people at different times over the course of several centuries, and that answer, which seems more complicated, is actually more terrifying than any version with a single culprit. The most famous episode involves Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Caesar was besieged in the royal palace of Alexandria, caught in the middle of the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy. To prevent the enemy fleet from cutting him off from the sea, he ordered the ships in the harbor to be set on fire. The fire spread to the docks, and according to the philosopher Seneca, who cites a now-lost work by Titus Livius, 40,000 scrolls stored in the port's warehouses were destroyed in that fire. 40,000 scrolls in a single afternoon, as collateral damage from a war that mattered far more to Caesar than books. Was this the end of the library? No, because the library was not a single building. It was a complex of facilities scattered throughout the city. Years later, Mark Antony gifted Cleopatra 200,000 volumes from the rival library of Pergamon to compensate for the losses. The library continued to exist. The next blow came in the year 391 AD. By then the Roman Empire was Christian, and Emperor Theodosius had decreed the closure of all pagan temples. Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, with an imperial decree in hand, organized the destruction of the Serapeum, the temple where the so-called daughter library operated, an additional facility that housed part of the collection. What remained there was burned or scattered. There is a third episode, the most famous one in the popular imagination, the Arab conquest of Alexandria in the year 640 AD. The story goes that Caliph Omar ordered his general, "If those books agree with the Quran, we do not need them. If they contradict it, we must destroy them, and that the books were used for 6 months to heat the city's public baths. It is a powerful story. It is also almost certainly a fabrication. The historian Bernard Lewis, one of the most respected authorities on the history of medieval Islam, demonstrated that this story does not appear in any Arabic source prior to the 13th century, 600 years after the supposed event. No author contemporary to the Arab conquest, whether Arab, Christian, or Jewish, mentions the destruction of any library. And what modern historians have established is that when the Arabs arrived in Alexandria in 640, the library, in the sense that we know it, had ceased to exist decades, possibly centuries, earlier. No one burned the Library of Alexandria on a stormy summer afternoon. The library died as many things die, slowly, over generations, through partial fires, political neglect, lack of funding, and wars that prioritized other forms of destruction. It was a death by accumulation of neglect. And that version is, in a way, more terrifying than the one involving the Great Fire, because the Great Fire could have been prevented. Systematic neglect, the powerful's disinterest in preserving what is not immediately useful to them, that pattern is harder to combat because it has no clear culprit. But there is something we do know for certain about what was lost. The poet Sappho of Lesbos wrote approximately 10,000 verses collected in 9 books. Today, 650 verses survive. Of the rest, fragments. Sometimes a single line, sometimes just an isolated word that papyrus scholars salvage from burnt and deteriorated fragments. 650 out of 10,000. Aeschylus wrote approximately 90 plays. We have 7. Sophocles wrote approximately 120. We have 7. Euripides wrote approximately 90. We have 19. What we know as classical Greek literature, that heritage we call the foundation of Western culture, is a small fraction of what once existed. The rest was lost, not in a great fire, but in the sum of 1,000 small destructions, of centuries of neglect, of copies that no one made because there was no longer money to pay for them. There was a Greek mathematician named Archimedes who worked in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. He was ahead of integral calculus by nearly 2,000 years. He calculated the value of pi with a precision that Europe would not achieve again until the Renaissance, and most of his works were lost. But in 1906, a Danish philologist named Johann Ludwig Heiberg discovered something extraordinary in the city of Constantinople, a 13th century prayer book. A perfectly ordinary prayer book, except for one detail. Beneath the religious text, erased but not completely removed, there was another, older text. Someone, at some point in the Middle Ages, had taken a parchment containing works by Archimedes, scraped it clean to reuse it, and written prayers over it. The scraped-off text never completely disappeared. Using modern imaging techniques, researchers were able to recover the original text. And in that palimpsest, that reused parchment, they found a work by Archimedes that no one knew existed, the method of mechanical theorems, in which the mathematician explains his thought process with a clarity that no other text of his had preserved. 2,000 years of waiting to recover a book, thanks to the fact that someone in the Middle Ages hadn't scraped the parchment hard enough. How many other books were lost because the scraping was complete? That question has no answer. Now we travel to a continent that Europe didn't know existed, and to a crime that forever changed what humanity knows about itself. The year is 1562. The place is Mani on the Yucatan Peninsula in what is now Mexico. And the man who is about to do something that historians still call ethnocide today is 38 years old, a Franciscan, fluent in Maya, and absolutely convinced that he is doing the right thing. His name is Diego de Landa. Diego de Landa's story is the strangest and most disturbing of all the ones we're going to tell today, because it isn't the story of a man who hated what he destroyed. It's the story of a man who loved what he destroyed, and he destroyed it anyway. Landa arrived in Yucatan in 1549 with the mission of converting the Maya to Catholicism. And unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not arrive with disdain for the culture he encountered. He arrived with curiosity. He walked through the jungle for years, learned the language with the patience of a scholar, and gained the trust of the Maya priests to the point that they showed him their sacred writings. The Maya had books. They called them hun. They were made of processed tree bark, folded like an accordion, painted with mineral pigments, and covered with glyphic writing that combined syllables and logograms with images of deities, animals, and calendrical symbols. Their material quality was superior to that of Egyptian papyrus, and their content was one of the most extraordinary accumulations of knowledge in the world of the 16th century. Those books contained the astronomical tables with which the Maya predicted eclipses with pinpoint accuracy. They contained the calendars, the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Hab, interwoven in a 52-year cycle that European astronomers of the time could not have calculated without modern instruments. There were medical treatises, rituals, royal genealogies dating back centuries, the history of migrations and wars, and the great rulers of a people who had spent more than 2 millennia building cities, devising calendars and observing the sky. Landa knew all of that. He had studied it. He admired it. And on July 12, 1562, in the Plaza de Mani, he burned it. The trigger was the discovery that some Maya who had converted to Catholicism continued to practice their rituals in secret. For Landa, that was not just heresy, it was apostasy. It was the devil disguised as tradition. And what he had admired as an intellectual curiosity suddenly became evidence of diabolical work. Landa himself described what he did in his work Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, written years later. We found a large number of books of their writings, and because there was nothing in them that did not contain superstition and the devil's falsehoods, we burned them all, which they felt deeply and found painful, which they felt deeply and found painful. Landa saw the Maya weeping as their books burned. He recorded it. And he continued burning. In addition to the codices, approximately 5,000 sacred Maya objects, 13 stone altars, and 197 ceremonial vessels were burned that day. And according to other chroniclers of the time, the destruction was not limited to objects. There was torture. Mayan priests were hung by their wrists with weights on their feet. Some died. Others were left with permanent mutilations. Bishop Francisco de Toral, Landa's superior, was so horrified upon learning of this that he dismissed him and sent him back to Spain to answer for his actions. But the damage was already done. How many books did Landa burn that day? Landa himself says 27. Other chroniclers suggest there were more. No one knows the exact number. But what we do know is that of all the Mayan books that ever existed, of all the texts that scribes had created over centuries, 4 survive today. 4 known pre-Columbian Mayan codices, 3 in Europe, and 1 whose fragments are in Mexico. 4 of what must have been tens of thousands. And those 4 are not in Mexico. They are in Dresden, Paris, and Madrid. They arrived in Europe as curiosities sent to the Spanish crown. The people who created them never recovered them. Mayanist William Gates wrote something worth pausing to reflect on. 99% of what we know today about the Maya we learned thanks to what Landa told us in his Relación. And that same Landa destroyed 99 times more Maya knowledge than he preserved for us. The destroyer became the sole chronicler of the destroyed. There is no equivalent to this in history. Some 30 years before Landa, on the central plateau of Mexico, an even greater and less remembered destruction took place. The man responsible was Juan de Zumárraga, the first bishop of Mexico, a Franciscan like Landa, equally convinced that he was saving souls. In 1529, Zumarraga organized the destruction of the Texcoco archive, the largest repository of manuscripts in the Aztec world. The chronicler Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl, who was the grandson of Texcoco rulers, wrote decades later that all the historical records, all the books of science, all the calendars, and the entire written memory of a civilization that had been accumulating knowledge for centuries were burned in that bonfire. The Spanish chronicler Alonso de Zorita wrote in 1540 that he had seen with his own eyes indigenous books on the Guatemalan highlands that recounted the history of 800 years prior, interpreted by very elderly Indians who had memorized them. Those books also disappeared. Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who became the most passionate defender of the indigenous peoples in the 16th century, wrote with a bitterness that resonates across the centuries. These books were seen by our clergy, and I was even able to see the burnt remains, apparently burned by the monks because they thought they might harm the indigenous peoples in matters of religion. Las Casas saw them, already burned, too late. What existed in those Aztec and Maya manuscripts that time did not return to us. The records of the movements of Mars, Venus, and the Moon, which modern astronomers have verified the Maya calculated with a precision that European astronomy would not achieve until the 17th century. Treatises on herbalism, medicinal plants, and treatments that 16th century doctors in Europe would never have imagined. The history of migrations, wars, treaties, and the great rulers of civilizations that had existed for millennia on the continent that Europe was just discovering. All of that existed. We know this because the chroniclers who arrived just after the destruction mention it. They saw it already in ruins, already in ashes, and recorded that something extraordinary had just vanished. Now we cross the Atlantic back, and we arrive at an institution that lasted 400 years, that operated on 3 continents, and that built the most elaborate and enduring system of book censorship that history has known. Its official name was the Tribunal of the Holy Office. The world knows it as the Inquisition. The Inquisition was not born as a book-burning machine. It was born as a tool to detect and correct heresy within the Church. But over time, especially after Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in the 1440s, it became something else, a mechanism for controlling thought on a massive scale. The printing press changed everything. Before Gutenberg, a heretical book was dangerous, but manageable. If there were 10 copies of a problematic text, you could destroy all 10. After Gutenberg, a work could be printed in thousands of copies within weeks. Knowledge became exponentially harder to suppress. The Church's response was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books. Officially promulgated by Pope Paul IV in 1559, it began with a list of approximately 700 titles. Over time it grew, and it kept growing. That index included the works of Galileo Galilei, who had demonstrated that the earth revolved around the sun, the works of Nicholas Copernicus, the writings of Erasmus of Rotterdam, the most influential humanist of his time, the works of Martin Luther, parts of Petrarch, texts by Francis Bacon, even, in some editions, parts of Cervantes' Don Quixote. The Catholic Church's index of prohibited books remained in effect, with variations, until 1966, 407 years. In Spain, the machinery was particularly relentless. The Pragmatic Decree of 1558 established that anyone who printed, sold, or possessed a prohibited book without a license could be sentenced to death, for owning a book. In 1490, in Salamanca, the Inquisition burned 6,000 volumes on magic and sorcery from the university itself. 6,000 books from a university. In Seville that same year, large quantities of Hebrew Bibles were destroyed. In Valladolid, in 1558, 27 books were burned in a public ceremony in the first documented auto da fe of the Index. Inquisition inspectors searched university libraries, convent collections, and bookstore inventories. Readers denounced their neighbors. Booksellers denounced their customers. A book on the wrong shelf could trigger an investigation that ended in confiscation, excommunication, exile, or worse. But here is something that textbooks rarely mention: the period of peak effectiveness of the inquisitorial censorship system in Spain, which historians place roughly between 1559 and 1640, coincides exactly with the period when the scientific revolution was unfolding in the rest of Europe. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Newton. The great explosion of modern scientific thought occurred during the very years when Spain was burning the books containing the ideas that could give rise to that thought. The consequence was not only cultural, it was economic, it was political. It was the beginning of a decline that Spanish historiography still debates. There was something else, however, that the Inquisition could not fully control, something that is extraordinarily human. Some of those charged with censoring texts preserved them in secret. The librarians who were supposed to oversee the purges sometimes looked the other way. Monasteries and universities became clandestine refuges. In cities like Toledo, Florence, and Paris, there were informal networks for exchanging books, circuits of free thought operating beneath the official surface. Because knowledge, like water, finds a way. There is one city that embodies better than any other that tension between the destruction of knowledge and its survival. And that city is Constantinople. In 1204, knights of the Fourth Crusade traveling to liberate Jerusalem attacked and sacked Constantinople, a Christian city attacked by crusaders who claimed to be fighting for the Christian faith. The sacking lasted for days. The libraries that preserved classical Greek manuscripts that Western Europe had lost centuries earlier were looted or destroyed. What did not burn was stolen. What was not stolen was abandoned. 2.5 centuries later, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed II was, in many ways, a cultured man. He learned Greek. He protected artists. But the conquest was not gentle on the books. Greek manuscripts that had survived the Crusaders did not survive the Ottoman conquest. Unique texts that had remained in the city for 1,000 years disappeared in a matter of days. But something happened here that history rarely acknowledges for what it was: the greatest unintentional cultural rescue of antiquity. When it became known that Constantinople was about to fall, the Greek scholars living in the city fled. And they did not flee empty-handed. They took manuscripts with them. They took texts that Western Europe had not seen in centuries. They took the complete works of Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, and Plutarch. And they arrived in Italy, and what they brought with them ignited the Renaissance. The knowledge that Constantinople lost became the intellectual seed of Florence, Rome, and Venice. The destruction wrought by the Ottoman Empire on the Bosporus would blossom, generations later, in the works of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. A city's pain was the lifeblood of a civilization. The story of the destroyed books is not just the story of what was lost. It is also the story of what survived against all odds, and sometimes they are the same story. In late 15th century Florence, there was a preacher who filled the cathedral and made the most powerful tremble with his sermons on the end of time. His name was Girolamo Savonarola. He was a Dominican, and he was absolutely certain that Florence, the most refined and richest city of the Italian Renaissance, was also the most corrupt. For 4 years, between 1494 and 1498, Savonarola ruled Florence without having been elected to any office. He ruled from the pulpit, and what he preached was simple: the vanities of the world were the path to hell. In the winter of 1497, he organized what history calls the Bonfire of the Vanities. In the Piazza della Signoria, the heart of Florence, His followers set fire to a pyramid of confiscated objects: mirrors, cosmetics, musical instruments, luxurious clothing, playing cards, and books. Illuminated manuscripts that had cost fortunes, works by Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron, books of poetry, philosophy, and science. Some accounts from the time say that Botticelli himself, the painter who had created The Birth of Venus and Spring, voluntarily threw some of his own works into the flames. The following year, in 1498, in the same Piazza della Signoria, a different fire burned. Savonarola was burned alive. In the very same place where he had burned the books, the city returned the favor. History exacts its revenge in ways no fiction writer would dare to invent. In everything we have covered today, there is a pattern that repeats itself with a consistency that is impossible to ignore, no matter the century, no matter the civilization. It doesn't matter if the destroyer was a Chinese emperor, a Franciscan bishop, a Dominican inquisitor, or an apocalyptic preacher. The underlying reason is always the same. The book gives the reader a capacity that power cannot control, the capacity to compare. The peasant who reads about kingdoms where rulers were different can imagine that his own ruler might be different. The believer who reads alternative philosophies may wonder if his own is the only truth. The subject who knows history can recognize in the present the mistakes of the past. The book does not merely inform. The book creates a distance between the reader and the reality imposed upon him. And that distance is the space where all dangerous questions are born. Qin Shi Huang understood this in 213 BC. The Inquisition understood this in 1559. Diego de Landa understood this in 1562. Savonarola understood this in 1497. In different languages, in different cultures, with different justifications, they all reached the same conclusion. The book I cannot control is a threat I must eliminate, and they all eventually failed, because knowledge, like water, finds a way. The Chilumbalam, the books the Maya wrote in secret after Landa burned the codices, preserved fragments of the cosmology and history the Franciscans wanted to erase. The Greek scholars who fled Constantinople ignited the European Renaissance with the manuscripts they carried under their arms. The monks who secretly preserved the texts condemned by the Inquisition kept alive the thought that the inquisitors wanted to silence. Archimedes survived in a palimpsest that someone scraped without enough force. Every act of destruction found, somewhere, someone willing to preserve what others wanted to erase. But that resistance comes at a cost. And the cost is that not everything survived. The 9 tragedies of Aeschylus that we do not have will not be recovered by any secret archive. The Mayan astronomical calculations that burned in Mani in 1562 will not appear in any palimpsest. The history that the Aztecs had been writing for centuries and that Zumarraga reduced to ashes will not return. What we lost forever. And that matters. It matters not as a historical curiosity, not as a tidbit for after-dinner conversation. It matters because every time a civilization destroys the knowledge of another or the knowledge of its own that makes it uncomfortable, it is deciding what kind of world the generations not yet born will live in. Qin Shi Huang decided that the Chinese of the 2nd century BC would live in a world where the past began with him. The Franciscans of the 16th century decided that the indigenous peoples of the Americas would live in a world where their history had never existed. The Inquisition decided that Europeans from the 15th to the 18th centuries would live in a world where certain questions could not be asked. We live in the world those decisions built. We are, in part, the result of what they burned. That idea deserves a few seconds of silence. The destruction of books did not end in 1800. It continued in 1933 in Berlin, when Minister Joseph Goebbels organized the burning of books by Jewish, communist, and pacifist authors in public squares throughout Germany. The poet Heinrich Heine had written it with prophetic clarity a century earlier in 1820, where books are burned, men are eventually burned. And Heine was right. The book burnings of 1933 preceded the concentration camps. The destruction continued in 2001 in Afghanistan when the Taliban dynamited the Buddhas of Bamiyan and destroyed the Kabul Museum Library. It continued in 2012 in Timbuktu when al-Qaeda jihadists set fire to a library that housed nearly 400,000 medieval manuscripts, some of them unique in the world. A man named Abdel Qadir Haidara, without resources, without armies, driven only by the conviction that what he guarded could not be lost, organized the clandestine rescue of hundreds of thousands of those manuscripts before the flames reached them. The same instinct that led Landa to burn the Mayan codices is still alive. And the same instinct that led medieval monks to secretly preserve what the censors wanted to destroy is also still alive. That is the longest battle in human history, longer than any war, longer than any empire. The battle between those who believe that knowledge must be controlled and those who believe that knowledge must be preserved. And the question this story leaves you with is not about the past, it is about the present. What is being lost right now at this very moment as this video ends? What languages are dying without anyone documenting them? What oral traditions are disappearing with the elders who have no one to listen to them? What digital archives will be lost when the servers fail and no one has made a copy? Fire is no longer always fire. Sometimes it's a hard drive that no one backed up. Sometimes it's a language that the last speaker takes with them. Sometimes it's simply oblivion, that silent destroyer that Qin Shi Huang already knew about, and that proves more effective than any bonfire. The books they burned before 1800 are gone forever, but the ones that exist today can still be saved. That decision isn't made by emperors or bishops. We make it. If this story moved you in any way, if it made you think of something you hadn't considered before, tell me about it in the comments. I want to know which of the forms of destruction we saw today struck you as the most impactful. Which one you felt closest to? Which one raises the most questions for you? That conversation is part of what it means not to let knowledge disappear in silence. And if there's someone in your life who should hear this story, someone who believes the past is already settled and has nothing to teach us, share this video with them. Because the first defense against the destruction of knowledge is knowing that it happened, and the second is not letting it happen again.